but fruitful interaction between person and community there is understood, and also sustainable, hopefully also harmonious relationship between human species and nature. And then in the Confucian tradition, which is different from many other traditions, is the mutuality or mutual responsiveness between human heart and mind and the will of God. And these four dimensions will have to be taken into consideration. And each tradition may have its own uniqueness, but it does not mean that uniqueness will not provide rich resources for intercivilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Weiming, for the very interesting lecture. We will now have a short question and answer session. And now I invite Yang Berbagi Prof. Tan Sri Datuk Dr. Sharifah Hafsah Syed Hassan Shahudin to chair the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tu. Taken us right through a very interesting discussion of dialogue. I didn't know it could take so long talking about this very important topic, and I am sure there are, I can see from the audience, there's also a big diversity in the audience here, Professor Tu must tell. And I think we will have a very interesting question and answer session. I will give them like 1 or 2 minutes, I think they're thinking, before they come up with some questions or comments from you. And you can touch on anything that Prof. Tu has taken us right through. And I think the important issue about the dialogue on core values, based on, I think, humanism. So if I can open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Sri. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Professor Tu Weiming, because I have been attending lectures for the past how many years. It's the first time I noticed the audience in the Senate room was so kept silence. They just pay attention to whatever the professor has said. And I can see that they're so engrossed and talk. That shows Professor has been a very engaging person. He knows how to attract the audience. One question for you, Professor. Did you foresee the rise of China since 1978 or before that in your studies on China and Chinese civilization?
I don't think I have to foresee. Let me give you one example. The situation changes so dramatically. A few years ago, a very eminent colleague of mine who was a scholar in economics with emphasis on East Asia, Dwight Perkins. He gave a series of lectures at the University of Washington. And the title of the lectures was, Will China be a new economic giant, but with a question mark? And at the time, the overwhelming majority, he may be the lone voice, overwhelming majority of the economists specialized in China just considered China's a kind of poverty-stricken country would continue for at least a century. That's the consensus. Then I asked him about his prophetic power. He said, I'm sorry, I put that question mark. So this idea of China's re-emerge as economic superpower is widely acknowledged. However, Professor Lester Thoreau of MIT, in 1999, he published a book called Head to Head, talking about major competition in the geopolitical context. He identified Japan, Germany, and the US as the three major players and concluded that Germany would be the winner. And I met him, I know him quite well. I met him and I asked him, not in the last 2 or 3 years, but in the last 5 or 6 years, why he didn't even take into consideration of what I call the Chinese factor. He traveled to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China many times. He said, look, Weiming, you are a historian, a philosopher, so you think about those issues. I am an economist, so I based my judgment on empirical data. Now, Chinese economy is 1/10 of Japan's. And I think we'll wait for 50 years before we begin to talk about China.
Yes.
As is presented in your CV, short CV, you deal with religion. And as you know, there are many approaches to religion. And one of the approach that developed by some scholars is what is called essentialist or civilizationalist. And this approach see, for example, Islam, the Quran and the Hadith full with violence and terrorism. What is your comment for this kind of approach to Islam, Quran and property tradition?
I think the approach is definitively wrong, and the consequences derived from this particular essentialistic approach turn out to be not only untrue but disastrous for everyone. And I have to give you, I have to nuance that answer with a couple of examples. It's a painful experience, one very painful example. I taught at Princeton University for 4 years. So one of my colleagues at Princeton at the time was Bernard Lewis. And there's no question about the fact that he was a very eminent historian of the Arabic world, of course Islam. And he's very knowledgeable. In fact, he's so knowledgeable of some outstanding Islamicists or Arabic scholars turn out to be his students. And yet, he has this unfortunate, and I would say extremely aggressive attitude towards Islam. Not only he characterized Islam as violent, as untruthful, as full of fiction, he condemns Islam as a major problem for human community. His article, published probably 1992 or 93 in the Atlantic Monthly, entitled "The Rage of Islam," in fact was the basis for Sam Huntington's book and thesis on the clash of civilizations. So I think, the tragedy, another tragedy, the irony is that a person was so seasoned in terms of his erudite, in terms of this, and yet his whole attitude, his whole approach, is so unproductive and extremely destructive. So I think it's very important for us to understand this. Another example, which I think it's a enlightening example, but again, it's also troublesome. That's Edward Said. Edward Said is a great sympathizer for the Palestinian cause. He was actually a friend of Holland. And but he grew up in a Christian environment, and he became so much seasoned in Western arts and literature. He's a great pianist, and also he's a great music critic. And his involvement in Islam or in the Arab culture is actually quite limited, because he didn't speak and so forth. It's very sympathetic. So you have a kind of ironic situation that Bernard Lewis was seasoned in Arabic scholarship, and is the opposite of any kind of measured and balanced judgment about a tradition that you've been studying. Just the opposite. And you have Said, who is so much personally identified with the tradition, and yet doesn't have, did not have the knowledge to back it up.
Food, and then 1 minute. I have to control this. Food, Monera, and then the gentleman at the back there, and I have Rashila.
Anything from. But why did you choose Bernard Lewis? And secondly, of course, the last 4 dimensions of your way out of an on-pass would be rather confusing. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Great apology. The 4 dimensions to the end. And actually I developed a whole paper. I hope I eventually write a book, so I can give you a very, just a glimpse of what I have in mind. I think the time is right for us, with your expertise and your scholarship in indigenous traditions, you appreciate this. We need to go beyond the Enlightenment mentality with emphasis on anthropocentrism, aggressiveness towards nature, and rationality understood purely in terms of instrumental rationality. We have a humanism which is rooted in the human community, but at the same time it's open. So first, the question about self-cultivation, self-understanding, self-knowledge. And then the fruitful interaction at many different levels with the community at large. So integration of the person and fruitful interaction between the person and society variously understood. And the third one is a sustainable and harmonious relationship between human species as a whole and nature. This is again a reflection of and a critique of the secular Enlightenment thinking. And the 4th dimension is fruitful interaction or mutuality between the human heart and mind and the way of heaven in the Confucian tradition. So this leads to, now I feel a little bit uneasy about it, but more than 30 years ago, I was forced to come up with a definition of religion, or not religion, I think the definition of being religious from the Confucian point of view. My attempt to do it is to, being religious means you're engaged in an ultimate self-transformation as a communal act, but also as a dialogical response to the transcendent. In other words, there are 3 dimensions you have to take into consideration. One is yourself. It's an ultimate concern. It's always, the second one is the community. You cannot be religious all by yourself. And then the third one is the transcendent.
My interest is primarily in India, and you mentioned developing a dialogical, a dialogue more with China. How would this dialogue contribute to the problems that India faces, predominantly poverty and corruption? Thank you.
I don't know whether the dialogical interchange itself will reduce poverty or reduce corruption. But if you talk about the dialogue between China and India, and China suffers from corruption in a very serious way, there's no question about it. And China may be considered as a major economic power now. I think some people believe that within this year, Chinese economy will be number 2 in the world, which means the first US, China. But China is a poor country. The per capita income of China is probably 100